In the Middle Ages, the world was quieter than we can easily imagine today. Not quieter only in sound, but quieter in presence. There were no glowing screens, no constant announcements, no endless repetition of names. Life unfolded slowly, wrapped in routine and familiarity, and most people lived their entire existence without ever becoming known beyond a small circle of faces. Villages were modest clusters of homes surrounded by fields, forests, and narrow roads. Everyone knew everyone else, not by reputation, but by proximity. You were known as the miller's son, the woman who baked bread, the man who repaired roofs. Names mattered less than roles. Identity was practical, grounded in what you did, rather than who you claimed to be. Fame, as we understand it today, did not exist. There was no audience waiting to discover you. There was no stage broad enough for attention to spread quickly. Information moved only as fast as a person could walk or ride. A story had to be carried by a voice, remembered accurately enough, and retold with care. Most stories never traveled far at all. For the average medieval person, the idea of being known by strangers was almost unimaginable. Why would someone in another village care about your life? What reason would there be to speak your name where your face was unknown? And so, the world remained intimate. People rose with the sun and slept when darkness arrived. Days repeated themselves with comforting predictability. Seasons defined purpose. Survival required cooperation, not recognition. To stand out was not a goal. Often, it was something to avoid. In this quiet world, fame was not a desire. It was not chased, branded, or cultivated. It was an accident of circumstance, something that happened rarely and often unwillingly. A farmer whose crops survived a terrible winter might be spoken of with respect. A craftsman whose work endured for decades might be quietly admired. But even then, their renown was fragile. It existed only as long as someone remembered to mention it. There were no records to preserve greatness for most people. No portraits, no written biographies, no permanent trace. Memory was the archive, and memory was imperfect. Names slipped away, details blurred, achievements softened with time until they became simple impressions rather than facts. To be known was to exist briefly in another person's thoughts, and then to vanish again. This was a world where anonymity was natural, where obscurity was not a failure, but a condition of life, where peace came not from being seen, but from being rooted. Fame, when it appeared, was small and slow. It did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, perhaps as a mention by a traveler, or a comment made by a merchant passing through. It did not grow endlessly. It faded as easily as it formed. In this way, the Middle Ages were not empty of recognition. They were simply free from noise. People did not measure their worth by how many knew their name. Worth was measured in trust, in reliability, in contribution. If your neighbors respected you, that was enough. If your family was fed, that was success. Perhaps that is why the silence felt fuller. In a world without names echoing endlessly, life unfolded, gently, unobserved, unrecorded. And for most, that was exactly how it was meant to be. You were not watched. You were not compared. You were simply living. And in that quiet existence, fame slept, distant, rare, and almost unreal. Many of the people who became famous in the Middle Ages never knew that they were. Their lives passed quietly, marked by routine, effort, and moments that seemed ordinary at the time. Nothing announced their importance. No voice told them they would be remembered. They simply lived, unaware that their actions would outlast them. Fame did not arrive with recognition. Tia arrived with time. A monk might spend decades copying manuscripts by candlelight, his days filled with silence and repetition. He did not sign his work with pride. Often, he did not sign it at all. Yet generations later, others would admire the beauty of his letters, the patience in his lines, the devotion pressed into every page. His name might be forgotten, but his work would speak for him long after his hands were still. A healer in a small village might know which herbs calmed pain and which roots eased fever. She learned through experience, through watching, through quiet care. To her, it was simply what needed to be done. To others, it felt like something close to a miracle. Stories of her kindness traveled slowly, carried by gratitude rather than intention. A soldier might show courage once, just once, on a battlefield crowded with fear and noise. He would return home, changed, believing the moment had passed. But someone else would remember, and someone else after that. Over time, the story would grow, reshaped by memory, until the man became more than he ever knew himself to be. This kind of fame was delayed and invisible. It did not reward the living. It belonged to the remembered. People did not curate their legacy. They could not. Once a story left their mouth, it no longer belonged to them. It moved freely, altered by each retelling. Truth bent gently, not out of malice, but out of human nature. Details softened, motives simplified, doubts disappeared. What remained was essence. Person slowly transformed into a symbol of wisdom, courage, faith, or sacrifice. The human being, with their fears and uncertainties, quietly faded away. And in many ways, that was accepted. Was no pressure to manage an image, no need to explain oneself to an audience. Life was lived forward, without concern for how it might be remembered. And when fame finally arrived, it often came after death. A grave became a point of gathering. A name appeared in a chronicle. A story survived because it mattered to someone else. The person at the center of it all was already at rest, untouched by praise or judgment. There is something gentle about that distance. Fame did not disturb sleep. It did not demand performance. It did not intrude on daily life. It was a quiet echo, forming slowly in the background of history. To be famous in this way was not to be seen. It was to be felt. And perhaps that is why medieval fame felt softer, slower, and strangely kind. In the Middle Ages, a king was famous by default. His name traveled farther than any other, carried slowly across valleys, along rivers, and through towns he would never visit. It appeared on coins exchanged in markets, on decrees read aloud in village squares, and in prayers whispered by people who knew him only as a distant presence. And yet, despite this reach, the king himself remained far away. For most of his subjects, he was not a person, but an idea, a symbol of order, protection, and authority. His face, if it was known at all, was imagined through crude drawings or idealized descriptions. The real man, with his doubts, fatigue, and private fears, stayed hidden behind layers of ceremony and distance. Very few people ever saw the king with their own eyes. Fewer still ever heard him speak. His fame did not come from familiarity, but from abstraction. He was known everywhere and nowhere at once. In this way, royal fame was strangely lonely. The king lived surrounded by people, yet separated from them. Guards, advisors, and courtiers filled his days, but few spoke to him freely. Every word he uttered carried weight. Every gesture was interpreted. Even silence became meaningful. He could not walk unnoticed. He could not act casually. His presence altered rooms before he entered them. Fame followed him like a shadow, heavy and inescapable. Stories about the king traveled faster than truth. Some painted him as chosen by God, almost divine. Others whispered of cruelty or weakness. Both versions often ignored reality. The king became whatever people needed him to be, a source of hope, a focus of blame, a distant figure onto whom fears and dreams could be projected. And the king knew this. He understood that his fame did not belong to him. It belonged to the realm, to the storytellers, to history itself. His private self slowly dissolved beneath the public image, till even he might struggle to remember where one ended and the other began. There was comfort in power, but also confinement. A peasant could disappear into anonymity at dusk. King could not. Key's life was permanently visible, permanently judged, permanently remembered, even when misunderstood. Key, in a world where fame was rare, the king carried more of it than anyone else. And it was not always a gift. It was a role that could never be removed, a name that could never rest, a presence that lingered long after the man himself grew tired. This was what it meant to be famous at the very top of the medieval world, to be known by everyone, and truly known by almost no one at all. In the Middle Ages, some of the most famous people were those who tried hardest to disappear. They stepped away from comfort, recognition, and public life, seeking silence rather than attention. And yet, it was precisely this withdrawal that made them unforgettable. Saints were known not for what they claimed, but for what others believed they embodied. Many lived simple lives, marked by prayer, discipline, and quiet service. They avoided praise and often resisted admiration. Some retreated into monasteries. Others wandered as hermits, choosing solitude over society. Their goal was not to be seen, but to be faithful. The word traveled. People noticed patterns. A monk whose presence seemed calming, a woman whose prayers were said to heal the sick, a hermit whose advice carried unusual clarity. Stories formed gently, shaped by hope and need. In uncertain times, people searched for signs of meaning, and saints became those signs. Fame arrived without invitation. Pilgrims began to visit, not to see the saint perform, but to be near them. Proximity mattered. Being close felt comforting, as if holiness could be felt rather than understood. Even silence, shared in the same space, felt powerful. After death, this fame often grew stronger. Graves became places of gathering. Simple belongings turned into relics. Ordinary moments were remembered as miracles. Whether these stories were accurate mattered less than what they provided: reassurance, faith, and continuity. This kind of fame was slow and reverent. It did not demand constant presence. It waited patiently, unfolding across generations. Unlike royal fame, it was not enforced. It was offered willingly by those who believed, and yet it carried its own weight. To be revered was dangerous to the soul. According to medieval belief, pride was a threat. Many saints struggled deeply with the attention they received, seeing it as a test rather than a reward. They deflected praise, attributing everything to divine will. Their fame was not about identity. It was about absence. The less they spoke of themselves, the more others spoke of them. The quieter they became, the louder their memory grew. In a world filled with noise of survival and struggle, saints offered stillness. And stillness, it turned out, was unforgettable. This was medieval fame at its most paradoxical: to be remembered for trying not to be remembered at all. Some people became famous in the Middle Ages, not through power or holiness, but through violence shaped into meaning. They were warriors, knights, soldiers, commanders whose lives were ordinary until a single moment lifted them out of obscurity. Most medieval fighters were never remembered. Battles were crowded, chaotic, and unforgiving. Thousands fought. Very few were named. To survive was common. To be remembered was rare. And yet, sometimes, one figure stood out. Perhaps he held his ground when others fled. Perhaps he protected someone more vulnerable. Perhaps he died in a way that others found meaningful. The moment itself was brief, but memory lingered. Bards and storytellers transformed these moments into songs, not because they were perfectly accurate, but because they carried emotion, courage, loyalty, sacrifice. These were easier to remember than names or dates. And so, the warrior slowly became a story. His fear disappeared. His hesitation vanished. What remained was a cleaner version of events, shaped by rhythm and repetition. The song traveled farther than the man ever did, carried from hall to hall, warming cold nights with familiar verses. The warrior himself might never hear it. If he lived, he returned to ordinary life, perhaps unaware that his name had taken on a life of its own. If he died, the song replaced him entirely. Flesh turned into legend. A human life condensed into a few lines that others could remember. This kind of fame was fragile and powerful at the same time. Each retelling altered it slightly. Details shifted, motives improved. Over time, the story said more about the people telling it than about the person who inspired it. The warrior became a mirror for collective values: bravery, honor, resistance, hope. In this way, fame no longer belonged to the individual. It belonged to the community. The song was not meant to preserve truth. It was meant to preserve meaning, and meaning endured. Long after armor rusted and battlefields returned to grass, the song remained. Sung softly, slowly, often at night, when people needed reminders that courage once existed, and perhaps could exist again. This was medieval fame in its most poetic form. Not a face remembered, not a voice recorded, but a life transformed into sound, gentle, rhythmic, and endlessly repeated until sleep arrived. In the Middle Ages, knowledge itself was rare. Books were scarce, fragile, and precious. Most people would never own one, and many would never see one at all. In such a world, those who worked with words lived quietly, often invisibly, yet their influence could stretch far beyond their own lives. A scholar spent years learning in silence. He studied by dim light, surrounded by parchment and ink, copying, translating, and commenting on texts older than himself. His days were slow, repetitive, and deliberate. There was no rush. Understanding took time. Many scholars wrote anonymously, not out of fear, but out of humility. Knowledge was believed to belong to God, not to individuals. To attach one's name too strongly to an idea risked pride, and pride, once again, was something to avoid. And yet, their words traveled. A manuscript copied in one monastery might be carried to another, then copied again and again. Over decades, the text spread quietly, its author's name fading with each reproduction. What remained was thought itself, carefully preserved, gently reshaped, slowly absorbed. The scholar became famous without a face. Readers knew the ideas, not the person. They trusted the reasoning, not the reputation. A passage might be quoted for generations, its origin forgotten, its influence undeniable. This kind of fame was distant and abstract. It did not follow the scholar in daily life. He could walk through a village unnoticed, completely unaware that his thoughts were shaping minds far away. There was comfort in that invisibility. To be known only by one's words meant freedom from judgment. No one watched the scholar age. No one expected him to perform. His ideas stood alone, independent of his personality or circumstances. Long after his death, students continued to learn from sentences he once wrote in silence. His body returned to the earth. His name disappeared. But his thinking remained woven quietly into the foundation of future understanding. This was medieval fame, stripped of ego, a presence without a person, a voice without a face, lingering softly in the background of history. Not all medieval fame was tied to power, holiness, or ideas. Some people were known simply because they passed through many lives, again and again, without ever truly staying. The merchant traveled constantly. Roads were his home, markets his rhythm. He moved between towns, ports, and villages, carrying goods that others could not easily obtain. Spices, fabrics, metals, stories, all passed through his hands. People recognized him when he arrived. They remembered his voice, his accent, the way he bargained patiently or laughed easily. He was familiar without being close, known without being rooted. When he appeared, life briefly changed. New colors, new scents, new possibilities. And then he left. His fame was temporary, and local. In one town, he was the merchant who brings fine cloth. In another, the one who sells salt before winter. His name shifted. Hay's identity reshaped itself to fit each place. Unlike kings or saints, no stories were written about him. No songs were sung. Yet, during his lifetime, he was seen by more people than most. This kind of recognition was light and fleeting. Children waved as he passed. Shopkeepers greeted him warmly. Strangers trusted him enough to trade. But once he moved on, memory faded quickly. Another merchant would arrive. Life would continue. And perhaps that was the point. The merchant's fame lived only in the present moment, did not reach for eternity. It asked for no legacy. It existed in brief exchanges, in shared smiles, in practical usefulness. At night, resting in unfamiliar inns, he was free from expectations. No reputation followed him too closely, and each new place he could begin again. In a world where most people never left their birthplace, the merchant's moving presence made him unforgettable, and yet easily replaced. This was medieval fame, in passing, recognized by many, remembered by few, and carried lightly like the goods on his back.